Imagine an underground river, sometimes visible as it emerges into daylight, sometimes hidden as it flows beneath the surface, but always moving forward, always connected, always whole. This is how elemental wisdom has traveled through human history. The elements themselves teach us this pattern of emergence and submergence, the way water vanishes underground only to resurface miles away, the way fire seemingly dies only to be rekindled from hidden embers, the way air remains invisible yet ever present, the way earth receives all things into itself only to transform them into new life. The traditions we now call pagan and neo-pagan represent some of the most important channels through which elemental wisdom has been preserved, developed, and evolved. While formal philosophy and official religion often moved away from the elements as organizing principles, these traditions maintained not only the knowledge, but the lived practice of elemental engagement. Far from being mere historical curiosities, these traditions form a continuous thread of psychological insight, offering sophisticated tools for understanding and balancing our inner landscapes. In this chapter, we'll trace the journey of elemental wisdom through what might be called the hidden years, the periods when elemental understanding continued to develop and evolve despite no longer occupying center stage in formal philosophical discourse. We'll explore how elemental wisdom was preserved in folk practices, encoded in stories and symbols, revived through alchemical and hermetic traditions, and finally reintegrated with formal psychological understanding in the modern era. Throughout this journey, we'll see how the core psychological insights of elemental wisdom remained remarkably consistent, even as their expression evolved to meet the needs of different cultural contexts. As the classical Greco-Roman world gave way to medieval Europe, elemental philosophy didn't simply disappear, though it certainly retreated from its former prominence. The elements remained important in medical theory through the doctrine of the humors, which linked bodily fluids to elemental qualities and temperaments. Hippocratic and later Galenic medicine, which would dominate healthcare practices for centuries, maintained this elemental framework even as other aspects of ancient philosophy faded from view. Outside formal medical contexts, elemental understanding persisted most vibrantly in the everyday practices of ordinary people. Agricultural traditions maintained a deep awareness of elemental cycles and relationships. When to plant with the waxing moon, when to harvest at the peak of summer heat, how to prepare the soil, and how to read the winds and weather. Domestic crafts like brewing, baking, dyeing, and metalwork all required intimate knowledge of elemental properties and transformations. This shift from public philosophy to protected knowledge occurred in parallel with major religious changes across Europe. As Christianity became the dominant religious framework, older understandings didn't simply vanish but were integrated, adapted, or preserved in forms that could exist alongside new beliefs. Saints' days often corresponded with older seasonal celebrations. Holy wells maintained their significance, and elemental symbolism found new expression in Christian imagery and ritual. Among the richest preservers of elemental wisdom were the Celtic traditions of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. In these cultures, the elements were understood not as abstract principles but as living forces manifest in landscape and seasonal cycles. The four treasures of Ireland, the Spear of Lugh, the Cauldron of the Dagda, the Stone of Eiffel, and the Sword of Nuada, embodied the elemental powers of fire, water, earth, and air respectively. The Celtic calendar, marked by the festivals of Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Samhain, tracked the transitions between elemental dominances throughout the year. Imbolc honored the first stirrings of fire within the earth, as winter began to release its grip. Beltane celebrated the full emergence of fire and its union with the fertility of earth. Lughnasadh marked the maturity of the agricultural cycle and the balance of all elements in the production of the harvest. Samhain acknowledged the thinning of boundaries between worlds as elemental energies began to withdraw into the earth for winter renewal. What makes these traditions particularly significant from a psychological perspective is the way elemental wisdom was preserved through embodied practice rather than abstract theory. People didn't need to read philosophical treatises on the elements. They lived their relationships with elemental forces through seasonal rituals, agricultural cycles, craft traditions, and storytelling. While folk traditions preserved elemental wisdom through cultural practice, medieval alchemy developed it as a sophisticated system of transformation. Alchemical processes such as calcination, dissolution, separation, and conjunction were understood as both physical operations and psychological processes. Calcination, for instance, represented not only the burning of substances to ash, but also the psychological process of breaking down rigid structures of ego and identity to reveal their essential components. The famous alchemical maxim, "as above, so below," expressed this understanding that the same principles operate at all levels of reality, from the cosmic to the personal. The symbolic language of alchemy, with its kings and queens, ravens and doves, suns and moons, preserved elemental wisdom in forms that could survive periods of religious and political upheaval. Through periods when more explicit forms of elemental philosophy were viewed with suspicion, alchemy provided a framework through which elemental understanding could continue to develop under the guise of proto-scientific experimentation. Perhaps the most widespread channel for the preservation of elemental wisdom was the world of folklore and fairy tales. These seemingly simple stories encoded sophisticated psychological insights accessible to anyone who heard them, regardless of education or status. Fire appears in folklore as both destructive and transformative, the dragon's breath that threatens but also the magical forge that creates enchanted objects. Water takes the form of perilous seas but also healing springs, reflecting its psychological role as both overwhelming emotion and restorative connection to the unconscious. Earth manifests as the cave of initiation, the forest of mystery, or the mountain of achievement. Air appears as the realm of birds who bring messages, winds that carry travelers to new realms, or breath that brings life to inanimate forms. Characters themselves often embody elemental qualities, the fiery hero or heroine driven by passion and courage, the watery mermaid, Undine or wise crone connected to depths of feeling and intuition, the earthy dwarf or giant rooted in physical reality and natural law, the airy fairy, sylph or wizard connected to the realm of thought and spirit. These weren't merely storytelling conventions but sophisticated encodings of psychological archetypes related to elemental energies. What makes these folkloric transmissions of elemental wisdom particularly valuable is their emotional and imaginative impact. While philosophical treatises might explain elemental theory, fairy tales made people feel elemental energies and their transformations. While our focus remains primarily on the Western lineage of elemental understanding, it's important to recognize that elemental wisdom has emerged independently in cultures throughout the world. Far from being a uniquely European phenomenon, the recognition of fundamental energetic principles underlying both natural processes and human psychology appears to be a cross-cultural insight, though expressed through different conceptual frameworks. In East Asian traditions, the Chinese Wuxing system identifies 5 elements or phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, that interact in cycles of generation and control. The Japanese Godai system, influenced by Buddhist thought, recognizes 5 elements as well: earth, water, fire, wind, and void, spirit. Hindu traditions identify 5 tattvas or elemental principles: earth, water, fire, air, and ether, which correspond closely with later Western elemental systems that added spirit or quintessence to the classical 4 elements. Indigenous American traditions often recognize 4 primary directions and their associated elements, though the specific correlations vary among different tribal traditions. Similar directional elemental correspondences appear in various African traditions, though the specific elements and their attributes again show cultural variation. These cross-cultural parallels suggest that elemental understanding isn't merely a cultural construct, but a reflection of psychological realities recognized across diverse human societies. The Renaissance period witnessed a remarkable revival of interest in ancient wisdom traditions, including elemental philosophy. As classical texts became more widely available through translation and printing, and as religious restrictions on certain forms of inquiry relaxed, scholars and practitioners began to explicitly reclaim elemental understanding as a valuable framework for comprehending both the natural world and human psychology. The Hermetic tradition, purportedly descended from the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, became particularly influential during this period. Hermetic texts like the Corpus Hermeticum presented a vision of the cosmos in which elemental forces played a central role in both macrocosm and microcosm. This revival accelerated dramatically in the 19th century, when figures like Eliphas Levi, Helena Blavatsky, and members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn systematically reintegrated elemental wisdom into their magical and philosophical systems. These movements weren't simply recreating ancient practices but evolving them to address contemporary psychological needs. The Golden Dawn's elaborate system of elemental correspondences, linking elements to colors, tools, directions, and psychological states, represents one of the most comprehensive attempts to organize psychological experience through elemental categories. What makes these Hermetic revivals significant for our exploration is their explicit connection between elemental forces and psychological processes. Rather than treating the elements as merely physical principles or abstract philosophical concepts, these traditions recognize them as psychological technologies, tools for understanding and transforming consciousness. The mid-20th century witnessed a remarkable development in the history of elemental wisdom with the emergence of modern Wicca, largely through the work of Gerald Gardner, Doreen Valiente, and their contemporaries. What makes this movement particularly significant is its democratization of elemental practice, its translation of ceremonial magical systems into forms accessible to ordinary practitioners without extensive occult training. Gardner's system, influenced by both ceremonial magic and folkloric practices, placed the elements at the center of ritual work through the casting of circles, invocation of elemental guardians, and use of elemental tools like the pentacle, cup, wand, and athame. Valiente's contributions further emphasized the psychological dimensions of elemental work, framing ritual as a technology for achieving psychological balance and integration. Modern Wicca wasn't merely recreating ancient practices, but consciously developing a psychologically sophisticated approach to spirituality that could address the needs of people living in an increasingly technological and materialist society. By engaging with elemental energies through ritual, visualization, and symbolic work, practitioners could reconnect with aspects of experience often neglected in mainstream modern life. While Wicca represents one of the most well-known modern expressions of elemental wisdom, the broader pagan revival of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has produced a diverse array of approaches to elemental understanding. Reconstructionist movements focused on reviving specific historical traditions, Nordic, Celtic, Hellenic, Egyptian, and others, have recovered elemental practices specific to those cultural contexts. Earth-centered traditions like reclaiming have emphasized the ecological dimensions of elemental wisdom. Shamanic practitioners have explored the elements as realms of non-ordinary reality accessible through journeying techniques. What unites these diverse approaches is their recognition of the elements as both natural forces and psychological principles. Despite significant differences in theology, cosmology, and ritual practice, most contemporary pagan traditions share core psychological insights about the role of elemental energies in human experience. This diversity of approaches has led to considerable innovation in elemental practice, moving beyond historical recreation to psychological exploration. Contemporary practitioners ask not only, how did our ancestors understand the elements, but also, how can elemental wisdom help us navigate our unique modern challenges? Perhaps the most significant bridge between traditional elemental wisdom and contemporary psychological understanding was built by Carl Jung and the depth psychology tradition he initiated. Jung's concept of archetypes, universal patterns in the collective unconscious that manifest in dreams, myths, and cultural symbols, provides a psychological framework for understanding elemental energies. What makes Jung's work particularly significant is the academic legitimacy it provided for exploring traditional wisdom in psychological terms. This Jungian bridge continues to develop through the work of archetypal psychologists like James Hillman and Thomas More, who have further explored the psychological significance of elemental symbolism and practice. One of the most distinctive features of elemental traditions is their use of correspondence systems. Organized associations linking elements to colors, directions, tools, animals, plants, deities, psychological states, and countless other aspects of experience. Far from being arbitrary or merely poetic, these correspondence systems function as sophisticated cognitive frameworks for organizing and understanding experience. From a psychological perspective, correspondence systems provide conceptual structures that help us recognize patterns and relationships that might otherwise remain invisible. By associating certain experiences, emotions, or behaviors with particular elements, we develop greater awareness of how these aspects of our lives relate to each other. We begin to notice, for instance, that activities we associate with fire share common psychological qualities despite their surface differences. Research in cognitive science suggests that such symbolic systems fundamentally affect our perception and cognition. The categories through which we organize experience shape what we notice and how we interpret it. The most effective correspondence systems maintain a balance between structure and flexibility. They provide clear categories that help organize experience while remaining open to individual variation and cultural context. The best elemental systems aren't rigid taxonomies but living frameworks that evolve through practice and experience. One of the most widespread correspondence systems in elemental traditions associates the elements with the four cardinal directions. Typically earth with north, air with east, fire with south, and water with west, though variations exist across different traditions. This spatial mapping of elemental energies creates a powerful psychological framework for understanding our relationship to different aspects of experience. From a psychological perspective, directional correspondences help us spatially orient ourselves in relation to different psychological states and resources. When we physically turn to face different directions during ritual or contemplative practice, we activate not only the symbolic associations of those directions, but also distinct neural networks related to spatial orientation. Cross-cultural variations in directional correspondences reveal interesting psychological dimensions of how different traditions conceptualize elemental energies. Some Native American traditions, for instance, often associate north with winter and wisdom, east with spring and illumination, south with summer and growth, and west with autumn and introspection. The practical applications of directional correspondences extend beyond formal ritual to everyday psychological location work. Many practitioners find value in asking themselves questions like, where am I currently oriented in elemental space? Or, which direction element do I need to turn toward for balance right now? Another important dimension of elemental correspondence systems is the association of elements with physical tools and symbols. The pentacle or disc for earth, the cup or cauldron for water, the wand for air, the athame, ritual knife, or sword for fire. These material anchors for elemental energies play a crucial role in translating abstract understanding into tangible experience. The psychological impact of these physical tools operates through multiple channels. At the most basic level, the sensory qualities of the tools themselves evoke elemental associations. The solid weight of the pentacle grounds us in earth energy. The fluid movement of water in the cup connects us to emotional flow. The visual transformation of candle flame engages our capacity for change. The movement of the wand through air embodies our communicative intent. These sensory experiences bypass purely intellectual understanding to create embodied knowing. From a neuroscientific perspective, engaging with physical tools activates sensoromotor networks that help anchor abstract concepts in embodied experience. When we hold a cup of water and consciously connect with its elemental associations, we aren't merely thinking about water's qualities but experiencing them through multiple sensory channels. This multi-sensory engagement creates stronger neural associations and more integrated understanding than abstract contemplation alone. This material dimension of elemental practice highlights the sophisticated psychological insight embedded in traditional wisdom. Long before modern neuroscience confirmed the embodied nature of cognition, elemental traditions recognized that abstract understanding alone was insufficient, that deep psychological integration required engaging the body and senses in meaningful ritual action with symbolic objects. Perhaps the most complex aspect of elemental correspondence systems is the association of elements with deities or divine figures from various mythological traditions. These associations aren't merely poetic, but reflect psychological understanding of how elemental energies manifest in personified form through archetypal patterns of being, action, and relationship. From a psychological perspective, deities can be understood as personifications of elemental energies that allow us to relate to these abstract forces through familiar human patterns of relationship. The Jungian concept of archetypes provides a useful framework for understanding how deities function as elemental representatives. Archetypal figures emerge from the collective unconscious as patterns that organize our experience of fundamental energies and relationships. When we work with Bridget as a fire goddess of poetry, smithcraft, and healing, we're engaging with archetypal patterns that help us access and integrate specific aspects of fire energy in our own psyche. This approach to deity forms is psychologically sophisticated in its recognition that personal relationship provides one of the most powerful contexts for transformation. By engaging with elemental energies through archetypal figures with whom we can develop relationship, we access emotional and relational dimensions of learning that purely abstract understanding cannot provide. One of the greatest challenges in appreciating the psychological value of elemental wisdom is navigating between the extremes of literalism and reductionism. A more fruitful approach recognizes elemental systems as psychologically sophisticated models that offer valid insights into human experience, regardless of their status as physical theories. When we work with earth energy, we're engaging with a real dimension of human experience, the need for stability, grounding, embodiment, and material security, whether or not we believe Earth is a fundamental constituent of physical reality. This approach creates space for multiple interpretive frameworks without requiring choice between them. We can simultaneously appreciate the psychological insights of elemental wisdom, its spiritual significance in various traditions, and the different but complementary understanding offered by contemporary science. Each framework illuminates different aspects of our multidimensional experience, and integration comes not through reducing one framework to another, but through allowing each to contribute its unique perspective. As interest in elemental wisdom grows among diverse populations, important ethical questions arise about appropriate engagement with traditions from cultures other than one's own. The boundary between respectful learning and appropriative taking isn't always clear, particularly when involving traditions that have experienced historical oppression or colonization. A useful distinction emerges between appropriation and respectful engagement. Appropriation typically involves taking elements from another culture without permission, understanding, or acknowledgement of their source and context. It often commercializes or trivializes practices with deep significance in their original context. Respectful engagement, by contrast, involves approaching other traditions with humility, acknowledging sources, recognizing historical contexts, and engaging in meaningful exchange rather than one-sided taking. The value of acknowledging sources and lineages extends beyond ethical considerations to practical benefits. Practices divorced from their cultural and historical context often lose important dimensions of meaning and effectiveness. By recognizing the origins of elemental practices we adopt, we gain access to the wisdom embedded in their traditional applications and avoid superficial or distorted understanding. Building bridges across traditions while honoring boundaries requires ongoing dialogue rather than rigid rules. Different traditions have different perspectives on sharing their practices, and these perspectives deserve respect. Perhaps no contemporary issue more urgently calls for elemental wisdom than our current environmental crisis. As we face climate change, pollution, resource depletion, and biodiversity loss, the elemental understanding of our fundamental connection with natural forces offers valuable psychological insights for addressing these challenges. Elemental traditions have long recognized what modern psychology is only beginning to articulate, that human well-being depends on healthy relationship with the elements that constitute both our environment and our own embodied experience. The dissociation from natural rhythms and forces characteristic of modern industrial society reflects a psychological imbalance with profound consequences for both human and planetary health. Moving beyond exploitation toward relationship with natural forces requires a fundamental shift in how we understand ourselves in relation to the elements. Rather than seeing earth, water, air, and fire as mere resources to be used, elemental wisdom encourages us to recognize them as aspects of our extended being, forces with which we exist in reciprocal relationship and on which our well-being depends. Practical applications of elemental wisdom to contemporary environmental challenges include reconnection practices that help people experience their intimate relationship with elemental forces, decision-making frameworks that consider impacts on elemental balance, and psychological support for the grief, anxiety, and overwhelm many experience in the face of environmental crisis. By reframing environmental issues in elemental terms, we access deeper motivations for change than abstract statistics or distant threats can provide. As we've traced the journey of elemental wisdom through centuries of cultural evolution, what emerges is not a story of lost and recovered knowledge, but of continuous adaptation and development. The underground river has never stopped flowing. It has simply found different channels in different eras, sometimes visible in public discourse, sometimes hidden in folk practice, symbolic systems, or esoteric traditions. This historical continuity provides important context for contemporary practice. When we engage with elemental energies through ritual, contemplation, or psychological work, we aren't simply adopting New Age innovations or recreating ancient systems. We're participating in a living tradition that has continuously evolved to address human needs in changing cultural contexts. This perspective helps us appreciate both the deep roots of elemental practice and its capacity for ongoing relevance and innovation. The relationship between historical continuity and psychological insight reminds us that wisdom traditions aren't static repositories of ancient knowledge but dynamic processes of ongoing discovery. The psychological sophistication we recognize in elemental systems wasn't merely projected backward by modern interpreters, but was genuinely present in traditional practices, albeit expressed through different conceptual frameworks than those of contemporary psychology. As we look ahead to the practical applications explored in subsequent chapters, this historical context helps us approach elemental work with both respect for tradition and openness to innovation. Understanding where these practices come from and how they've evolved gives us a better sense of how to engage with them authentically in our contemporary lives. Not as museum pieces to be preserved unchanged, but as living tools to be skillfully adapted to our current needs and circumstances. The invitation, then, is to recognize this living tradition as the context for our personal exploration, not as a burden of obligation, but as a rich resource of tested wisdom. Like a river that has carved its course through centuries of landscape, elemental understanding offers a channel for our own journey of discovery and transformation.